6 of the deadliest military units in human history. Let's start with the Roman Legionnaire. The Roman Legionnaire at the height of the Roman Empire was a close quarters killing machine. It was part of the military unit known as the Roman Legion, which was divided up by 10 cohorts of men. Each legionnaire was armed with a pilum, which was a type of heavy javelin designed to pierce through enemy shields before contact was made. It had a soft iron neck that would bend upon impact, making it impossible to remove from the shield and use it against the legionaries. Next, they were armed with a gladius, which was a type of sword that was good for slashing and thrusting. They actually had another sword previously, but after the Battle of Cannae and the Punic Wars, they would adopt gladiuses that were reminiscent of swords used by Iberian troops. The Roman Legionnaire had access to many types of body armor. Some had access to lorica hamata, which was basically a type of armor made of mail linked with iron rings. As you can see right here, very reminiscent of chainmail. Some had access to lorica segmentata, which was basically heated strips of iron or steel that were linked together. And then some had access to a type of scale armor, which basically are overlapping metal plates that were sewn together onto fabric, resembling fish scales. Arguably the most important weapon was the large curved scutum shield that protected the exposed attacking arm of a fellow Roman legionnaire, created a unified wall of defense for the entire unit. It also had a metal boss in the center of it, which meant it could be used as a punching weapon, and together with this entire kit made the Roman legionnaire into a close quarters killing machine. Combat would start with legionaries throwing missiles at the enemy, then charging in for close quarters combat in order to break the enemy cohesion. Now the Roman, because he had access to a stabbing and slashing weapon, only needed a few inches of space to thrust their swords into the enemy's gullet. Units in the formation, after a few minutes of combat, would rotate to the back to prevent exhaustion. In the heat of combat, the legion could employ special formations such as the testudo formation or tortoise formation, where legionaries would raise their shields above their heads and around themselves, creating a roof of overlapping protection that blocked missile fire from coming into the unit. The effectiveness of the legionnaire was further enhanced by auxiliary units, which could fill up different roles that the heavy infantry Roman legion focus couldn't fulfill, such as Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, and then of course the Cretan archers. Mobile scorpions and larger ballista gave the legionnaire battlefield artillery support, as well as capabilities of siege warfare. Further aiding them were caltrops, which were a very simple invention designed to harm and slow down not just troops, but battlefield beasties like horses, camels, and war elephants. The Romans could also employ psychological warfare to intimidate their foes, banging their shields or staying completely silent while advancing before the entire Roman legion shouts a giant war cry at once. The most effective aspect of the legionary was the logistics of the Roman legion. You see, each legionary had to carry their own equipment with them, along with cooking and cleaning items as well. These were provided along with wages by the government, though sometimes they'll take out your wages to give you these equipment, so that's the government working as intended as well. Carrying all this extra weight, they had to walk on an average of 20 to 24 miles a day, and that is, depending on if they're at a normal pace or a speedy pace. Once they stopped, they would immediately start building ditches and ramparts around either temporary fortifications or camps or more permanent settlements. Sometimes they would also build roads and aqueducts and other major construction projects, but that's not a deadly fun fact. The legionary would then do nothing but drill and train for combat. The training itself was identical to everybody else's, and so that meant that because they were permanent fighting forces, if there was a high amount of casualties that were caused by a recent battle or catastrophe, experience was never lost. Legionaries would serve for typically about terms of 25 years. Afterward, they were given an honorable discharge, and they were given either payments in the form of land or a sizable paycheck. The success of the Roman legionary comes from centuries of adaptation. The first legionaries were actually phalanx units that were similar to the Greek colonies that were on the Italian peninsula. Then Rome would evolve into the Roman manipular army using the triplex assi system or triple assi system, which divided up the Roman army into maniples, as you can see right here. These maniples were made up of multiple lines of skirmishers, which were veletes, heavy infantry, which were either made up of principes or hastati, and then veteran spearmen, which were made up of triarii. They were deployed with gaps between the lines, which allowed for a degree of depth and flexibility. Now, these men were conscripted and went back to farming after their service was over. They also provided their own equipment, so your station in this army depended on that. This system would later change the consular armies into the Roman legion that we see today, and it became became a structured military-based system where there were multiple jobs and roles for the individual legionnaire. And in order to be part of this system, you only needed to be a Roman citizen. By 211 CE, there were about 33 legions, which amounted to about 450,000 legionnaires along with their auxiliary units. For centuries, the discipline and structure allowed Rome to dominate the battlefield across 3 continents. With the legions gone and Europe open for the taking, somewhere someone is building a boat. Here comes the Vikings. Vikings were Scandinavian raiders who prospered in what we know today as the Viking Age. This is a period of time where Vikings were looting across the world, from the shores of North America to the seas of the Mediterranean, Caspian, Black, Baltic, and of course the British Isles. People would typically say that this period started with the raid at the Lindisfarne Monastery at 793 CE on the British Isles. The Vikings had access to swords, spears, bow and arrows, and axes. Some of these weapons, especially the sword, were sacred and passed down from father to son, or were buried with the warrior upon death. The Dane axe was one of the most famous weapons that the Vikings used, specifically because it could bring down an opponent's shield with ease due to its broad, thin blade, giving it a powerful cut. In addition, the Vikings also used slings to great effect as projectile weapons as well. Now, protecting the Vikings, they had access to their shield, which could form up into a shield wall. More of that in a minute. They also had access to chainmail, leather tunics as well. Now, this would depend largely on the warrior's wealth. Now, Vikings would typically focus on fast raids and getting the fuck out as fast as possible, but they would also form shield walls for protection from missile weapons and overlap their round shields to form defensive barriers. When they wanted to break enemy lines, they would form wedge formations, known in English as boar's snout. This would be done by concentrating all their forces at a singular weak point here. They don't have to fight across this entire line. Sometimes there would be multiple of these formations connecting to one another, forming zigzag. Now, typically this formation was made up of the strongest and most experienced melee fighters at the front and the archers in the center and the rear of the formation. Now, the outer warriors will be on the left and right side, and they will hold spears to counter any horses that could attack this triangle formation here. Now, land combat wasn't their specialty. Instead, it was their ships. You see, they were built with a clinker fastened overlapping planks made with specifically selected old growth oak trees and reinforced with iron rivets. They were light, flexible, and they moved with the waves instead of against them, which made them incredibly fast. To give a sense of how fast they were, a replica was made in 1893, which reported speeds in heavy storms and seas as greater as 10 knots. For reference, a human being swimming could do about 1 to 2 knots on average, assuming they know how to swim, which I don't, so I will drown. And they were typically moved by either manpower with rowing with their oars, or with giant square sails using the power of the wind, which meant that they could travel in both open seas and shallow rivers. Sail could also be removed for storage and stealthy options, as well as getting underneath bridges. And because these ships typically had a shallow draft, which meant that they had a flat or near flat bottom, it allowed them to land almost anywhere, at beaches, riverbanks, or even inland settlements, effectively turning every river in Europe into a highway for invasion, and appearing, pillaging, and disappearing before an organized resistance could respond. Viking sea combat was pretty crazy too. Their shields would line the sides of their ship for missile protection. Volleys of arrows would be fired at these ships before aggressive boarding actions would be made. Vikings' mastery of naval technology opened up a whole slew of job opportunities for them. They excelled at piracy and slavery, but they also excelled at trade as well, which inevitably led to the sale of slaves. They also were mercenaries in many different areas. Even something called the Jomsvikings was created by a group of Viking warriors that would sell their services to the highest bidder. Some of them were even colonizers, creating new settlements and communities in North America. Many more would just simply raid on their off time as they were farming or crafting in their villages. Then they would come back with their loot and spoils and gain personal honor and glory. In fact, because of their massive success, the best way to counter Vikings was to simply pay them off in the aptly named Dane Gold, or Dane Geld. Now, what happens when war becomes tradition? The samurai. The early samurai fought as mounted archers, using what we know today as the Yumi bow, an asymmetrical bow made out of laminated bamboo wood and leather. They also obviously used the horse, hence mounted archery. But as warfare intensified, infantry and close quarters combat became equally important. We have pole arms, such as the naginata or yari spears as depicted here, rising to prominence, offering reach and versatility in close quarters combat. While swords had been a sidearm actually, and symbols of status status in the case of the katana here. The samurai would use lamellar armor, which was constructed from overlapping metal plates laced together with silk and leather. Now, these armor sets have been continuously adapted over the years, with more wealthy and armored variants such as the Orori or the less armored but more cheaper Dumaru. Portuguese traders introduced Japan to matchlock firearms, otherwise known as Tangashima, and the samurai quickly adapted to them, while not also abandoning the traditional arms that they were already accustomed to. Their armor would also continue to adapt with these changes as well, with the development of full plate armor, reminiscent of the armors that the Portuguese were using. Some of these armors were known as Namban Gusuku or Gusuko armor. So as you can see, the samurai developed from mounted archers to infantrymen to even firearm specialists. Samurai often fought for elevating their personal and familial status. Insults, challenges, duels were part of their form of warfare in addition to large formations, and victorious samurai often took up headhunting as proof of their achievements. Now, the samurai didn't come out of nowhere. They replaced early conscript armies with a hereditary warrior elite that formed the permanent military class in Japan's feudal system. You see here that at the bottom we have outcasts, commoners, and priests, and then samurai in red above all of these groups. The only groups that are above them would be other nobles and the imperial family. And because of their status, they enjoyed many privileges over the rest of the population. And as their services became more sought after, many young men would train themselves in the art of war, with many of these military trained men either swearing allegiance to the state or to powerful provincial lords known as daimyos. These daimyos would fight with their samurai armies in the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period in Japan, where multiple rival daimyos would fight it out for control over the Japanese islands. Through these epic battles, would rise through the ranks and possibly even become daimyos themselves. But after the Sengoku Jidai period, once Japan was unified, a prolonged peace followed. The role of the samurai began to change. The warrior elite gradually shifted from battlefield commanders to administrators and retainers, the jocks to nerd type shit. Sometimes numbers aren't everything, and you only need 10,000 men to create your empire. Here are the Persian Immortals. The Persian Immortals were an elite military unit of the Achaemenid or Persian Empire, numbering always at exactly 10,000. When one died, another would take its place. The Persian Immortals were typically armed with bows, spears, slings, and short swords. The problem is that we don't really have a lot of archaeological evidence for what that looks like. As you can see right here in this image of the Immortals in Persepolis, we see them armed with spears and with bows. For protection, the Persian Immortals would wear a type of scale armor and would wear a tiara on their heads, not for covering their heads for protection from missile fire like a helmet from the previous entries we've had, but more so to protect their heads, to cover their faces in case of dust or any type of environmental issues. However, unfortunately, we don't have a full look at what this tiara actually looks like. To separate commanders from their foot soldiers, their butt spike tips on their spears were silver for the commoners and gold for the commanders. The Persian Immortals were also further protected by the wicker shield, which was very effective against missile fire and was very lightweight, so it was easy to carry. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, was also the founder of the Persian Immortals, drawing upon populations from the Persian, Median, and Elamite peoples. Because of how integral the Persian Immortals were to the Persian military machine, they had their own dedicated supply train separate from that from the rest of the army, keeping them well fed, equipped, and ready for battle. On the battlefield, the Immortals were known to use tight formations. Spears and shield would form a solid front line, while archers behind them would deliver continuous volley fire. These coordinated assaults led to victory after victory for the Persian Empire, conquering Babylon at Opis, conquering Egypt at Pelusium, and conquering the Lydian Empire in Turkey in Thybra. It's only when the Persian Immortals went west into Greece that they found their true rival. Let's say you're a hoplite. Let's say you're the hoplite. And let's say only 300 of you were needed to stop hundreds of thousands of Persians from conquering Greece. The Spartans. Now, the Spartans wore bronze helmets and breastplates and greaves and arm guards, typical of many other hoplite armies. Their primary weapon was a large thrusting spear with an iron spearhead. It was made with cornel wood and had a butt spike at the end of it for balanced secondary use if the first one obviously fails. They also carried a backup iron sword, typically a xiphos or a corpus. These swords were roughly the length of a dagger, one of them being smaller smaller than the other one, which was perfect for Spartans as they preferred shorter swords for close quarters combat. Now, classically, Spartans fought in what we know as the phalanx formation, which basically had you and a bunch of dudes lining up line by line, densely packed, and having your spears out in front of you with a shield on your other arm protecting you. Now, the Spartan phalanxes were typically 8 ranks deep, as you can see right here in this picture, with the width determined by need of the battlefield. And they carried with them a two-handed wooden shield that had a reinforced layer of bronze. This shield would protect the left side of the body, while your exposed right side was covered by the shield of the man next to you. With tight coordination, discipline, and morale, Spartans were incredibly effective. And that was doubly so because they didn't have to work for all their labor. They had a completely separate slave class that was custom tailored to their economic needs. And so because of that, they didn't have to do anything besides drill and train for the phalanx formation. It starts with what we know as the apophthegm. That basically is where Spartan elders judge to see if a baby is weak or it has any ailments or deformities or whatever. And if they do, and they're not strong enough to live, they die. They're left on a mountain or thrown into a chasm. It's kind of debated if this is a uniquely Spartan thing or not. There's only one source that really talks about this happening. Boys were taken from their families, however, at age 7 and placed into what we know as the agoge. It was a state-run training system. It was pretty brutal, all sorts of physical tests, but on top of that, you also had to deal with punishments that could come from breaking its rules. But you also formed bonds with not only your fellow future soldiers, but also teachers above you. And those bonds that you build in the agoge continue into adulthood. Adult Spartans will continue living and eating amongst each other in what we know as the syssitia. And exclusion from the syssitia meant that you were excluded from Spartan citizenship and military service. So you see how the Spartans would have such strong cohesion and trust within the phalanx because they have trust with their fellow hoplite brethren. The Spartans' biggest claim to fame was during the Greco-Persian Wars. 300 Spartans, along with Greek allies, managed to slow down hundreds of thousands of Persian troops at the Battle of Thermopylae. And even though Xerxes would win this battle, it still cost him thousands of troops and his own Persian immortals in order to kill 300 measly Spartans and their Greek allies. The Spartans would continue to rise to dominance, even fighting their one-time allies, the Athenians, in the Peloponnesian Wars, where we see some hot hoplite on hoplite action against Sparta and its allies and Athens and its allies. Christian Balkan boys given the most advanced weaponry in the Ottoman arsenal, the Janissaries. The Ottoman Janissaries were infantry units that were initially formed from captured prisoners of war from Christian lands within the Ottoman Empire. They were originally armed with bows and arrows. This system would be institutionalized under Sultan Bayezid through the Devshram system, which would have a levy of youths taken from their families in Balkan Christian subject lands and trained for service to the empire. Now, Janissaries were typically organized into ortas, which are military units that served roles such as frontline troop or the Sultan's personal guard. Extremely crucial, as not only did they protect the Sultan over here who's barking orders at them, but also holding the center of engagements with their firearms to support artillery and cavalry operations. Now, by the 16th century, the Janissaries were armed with swords like the yataghan, and they were also armed with the bork, which was a type of white hat that they would wear. They also had access to advanced firearms as well. Every time there'd be a new model of a matchlock or a musket, the Ottoman Janissaries would get first dibs. They also had access to hand cannons known as abus guns, basically early forms of artillery or mortars that were set on tripods, but because of how light they were, they could be carried as if they were like just a normal ass gun. They also used early grenades as well. Their use of firearms made them very effective in many different conquests, most notably in the Siege of Constantinople and of course at the Battle of Chaldiran. They may have even pioneered rotating volley fire, as you can see right here by my drawing of two Ottoman Janissary ranks. The first rank will fire their guns, while the second rank will be busy reloading or waiting patiently for their turn. Afterwards, this first rank will rotate behind the second rank, and now the second rank will be firing their weapons, while the first rank will be busy reloading, allowing continuous gunfire without pause. And because of how powerful and how close they were to the Sultan, there was no way for them to, betray the Sultan by deposing him or rolling back restrictions or abusing their power or inflating their numbers or creating families now or yeah, they did do that. And that would be the 6 deadliest military units in history. Now, if you want to know which of these militaries I think are the deadliest, you can head over to my Patreon where I'll do a ranking tier list of all 6 of them. But let me know down in the comments below which military unit you would like to see in a future video. But anyway, class is now dismissed. I I guess I'll go this way.